Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this review video we're going to be looking at Within the Ring of Fire. There's my copy there, which is written by Underwood of RAW Immersive Games. It's a fantasy game. The book's about 200 plus pages, and it's the brainchild of Underwood, one of the members of the YouTube RPG Brigade. When it was released, someone suggested that it would be interesting to see how someone who's not been exposed to the YouTube hype and all the publicity surrounding it responded to the book. I agreed and have thus arranged for this interview to be split between myself and my wife Hannah, who, whilst a role player, is not involved with the YouTube RPG Brigade and knew nothing of the game until I purchased a copy. So Hannah, if you could say a bit about how long you've been role playing and what your exposure to role playing is.
Got into D&D when I was 12, 13, played that and many other games for many years. Worked in a role-play shop for 7 years. Continue to game now.
So, as I say, it's always my wife is a role player, but she is not involved in the YouTube RPG Brigade, the community online, that'd be fair to say.
Yep.
Okay. The game system itself, the central mechanic behind it, is a D8 based system with what's called exploding dice, where the rolls of 8 allow you to roll again and add both results. Now, the cover image on the book, which I don't know if you can see there, is very striking. Probably my favourite piece of art from the book, and it starts off with a nice comprehensive contents list, which is very nice, but I would have still liked an index at the back of the book. So we'll move on to chapter 1, which runs on from the contents page almost seamlessly into the rule. The first chapter of the book introduces a lot of terms and odd names, unfortunately, so the player won't know on first reading. I do, however, like the alternate terms for GM, which is flame tender, and they're all nicely themed around this idea of fire, which is very appropriate to the book.
I like shorthand. I like that lots of systems use the same names for these things. I don't tend to think they're necessary. What I would have liked to have seen was a glossary that told me all of these terms somewhere that I could keep referring back to.
Okay, another suggestion in the book is to make the saga really live, and I love this idea of the world evolving and changing. The game does seem to suggest a very large stable of NPCs, and it talks about giving the NPCs a few little traits based on their narrative importance, which is nice. It doesn't go too overboard with that.
This chapter also has some sections in it about simple rules for GMs and players to follow, including the classic Rule 7, which I don't think is put in its standard terms, but it's in there. Don't take the piss. On page 14, there's a mention about clouds being strange beasts, but it doesn't then tell us any more about that anywhere that I could see. It's an interesting idea. I'd like to hear more about it. There's also a point in here called Bring Back Player Actions. This is a really interesting mechanic that you can use to try and make your PCs feel more like heroes, or at least make them aware of the consequences of their actions. It's quite a cool idea. The whole early chapter doesn't read simply enough to be for first time role players. It's not something that someone who just walked into my shop would have picked up. There's suggestions that you need to do loads of prep for games, that you need loads of notes and spiel, and that's all good stuff to have if you're that kind of GM, but a first time gamer doesn't know whether they are or not. It's good to have lots of notes, but the stuff that's in here, particularly about like how to run a roleplay game, it's all great stuff. It's all really interesting.
We'll then move on to chapter 2, and I found a lot of the artwork in chapter 2 very good, even though there wasn't much consistency in the style of artwork used. The printing quality of the book's very good, although I didn't really think the racial summaries gave you enough detail in each section about the races. Now, I think this section could have done with going through more carefully, and some bits of it just tidying up a little bit and making more relevant. For example, there's several locations missing from the inside cover map.
And it's made me smile, but there's other places that they could have focused stuff, particularly throughout this chapter. Each of the races, there's a 2 or 3 paragraph discussion of breeding and who can breed with who, and it's all very entertaining. But I'd also like to know about the death rights of these races, about what technological levels they're at, about things like what kind of art they're into, who wears what fabric. But no, I've just got a 2 paragraph bit about breeding.
Okay, so just to skim quickly through a few of the different races, we're not going to go through them all in detail because there are a lot of different playable races in this book. There's a few things like the Ferrum, which are basically dwarves with a slight spin on them. There's a couple of nice little tweaks, but I don't think anyone's going to be under any illusion that they are dwarves by a different name. There's the Freyan, who are a little bit more different than your standard Fae or Elves. You weren't very impressed with the sort of gender reversal of the matriarchal society, particularly.
It didn't seem to work. It's been a while since we read that section, so I can't be too specific.
Okay. I think it was, when we were discussing it, I thought it was nice that the different creation mythos were included, and there were some nice real-world parallels to different ethnicities, especially for the humans, which was useful as a sort of shorthand to be able to play those characters. We've got the Kalfar, where it's merchants overtaking the previously aristocratical rule of their society, which is an interesting reversal and could make for an interesting campaign. Not really sure if it needed to be a different race, so you were saying.
Yeah, it just looked like another group of humans to me. They're an interesting idea, but I'm not quite sure that they're necessary in an early on book. I've noticed, having read more, that there's a lot of other races that are mentioned elsewhere in the book and not covered here. So I'm assuming that he's going to expand on all of this in a later book.
Yeah, I think that's the plan, yeah. Okay, so if we go on to the Mihangi, which are the Wolf Fae, what did you think of those?
They looked a bit White Wolf Werewolf, really. Again, interesting if you want to include that in your D&D campaign.
I think my main problem with them was I didn't really see them fitting into a group with other races very easily, which I thought if it was a mature group doing it, it could make some interesting role play. However, I could see it with maybe less experienced groups being quite problematical. I like the write-up. I thought for an evil race it was very good. I'd generally probably cast them as villains or NPCs rather than player characters, but maybe that's just my own sort of prejudices about that sort of character. I tend not to go for, certainly in fantasy or D&D-esque style games, go for like evil races. But I think if you had a mature enough group, it could be quite a good source of plot complication, plot hooks, but you really would have to put a lot of work and a lot of thought into how to incorporate them into a group.
I like shiny light heroes.
Yeah, I definitely think including them would change the tone of the game significantly.
Yeah.
To the opposite to that, really.
Uh-huh.
Okay, ogres. I quite like the idea of the ogres as a sort of everyman hero. You know, this big lumbering base that sort of gets put on by everybody, but has a sort of deep tribal tradition behind them. And I thought that was quite nice instead of just the normal, ogre smash and hit things with clubs. Same thing with the orcs, really.
Yeah, again, the orcs. It's nice to have this race of farmers, but there's already like a fantasy standard. Why mess?
Okay, we then got the Vayagish. Don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Who, to me, reminded me very much of the Githyanki from D&D with the serial numbers filed off. A very militaristic society. Although I did like the justification of having them known as Hobbs Goblins. The way that sort of tied in with the deities, I thought that was very well done. And I did like that it was a realistic model of a militaristic society, and that's nice to see, because normally when something's described as having a sort of militaristic background, they don't really go a lot into the society. They just go, they've got lots of soldiers, and that's it. Whereas I did think this gave a bit more detail, and I'm sure that'll be expanded on in future products.
Yep.
So overall, what would you say about the race chapter?
Overall, there was some information there. There was some interesting plot hooks. There wasn't the information I wanted, and there wasn't as much of the good information as I would have liked. You know, there were lots of little hints at stuff that I
Yeah.
wanted more of.
Yeah, I'd completely agree. I think there was a lot of little bits where I'd look at it and I'd go, "Oh, great, let's get on with this," and then that'd be all. There wouldn't be any follow up to it. Like you say, I think there was a lot of other things like death rights, birth rights, festivals, etc. General ecology stuff, really, that could have been
Yeah.
covered in a lot more detail. And I'm sure it will be sort of further on down the line in other products. But it would have been nice just to have a more balanced summary, I suppose, rather than so much focus on the breeding and certain other aspects of it. Okay, we then go on to chapter 3, which is the catalyst or character creation. And this chapter is very clearly written and laid out, although some of the explanations, such as in particular boosts, are a little confusing. The D8 system, the exploding dice system, seems fairly straightforward, although the use of D8 seems like a fairly arbitrary decision, although they might have been chosen for some reason I'm not aware of. I did actually ask this on the RAW Immersive Games Facebook group earlier on today, and it seemed I very much got the impression that the D8s were chosen simply because there's not many other games that use D8s, which is
Right.
which is no better or worse choice than any other isn't picking any other dice really. So that's absolutely fine.
When I looked at the numbers of it, you seem to be a lot more likely to get successes than failures, a lot more likely to get critical successes than to ever get critical failures. That seemed to be the only difference, really, in the meat of it compared with the D20 system. Otherwise, they are very similar.
You have to admit the system did seem very reminiscent of D20, albeit with some tweaks and additional rules, house rules, etc. And I don't see that beyond these tweaks it offered such a vast difference from the D20 system that it's going to drag a load of like converts over from that system. I thought it was all laid out fine, all perfectly functional. Although, I'm not a big fan of the crunch and the rules. If you like D20 or games like that, though, it's probably going to be right up your street. I did like the opulent stat that was in there, which represents your sort of like your fiscal wealth, your assets, etc. And I'm a big fan of anything that reduces the amount of bean counting or coin counting in a game. So I thought I've got to applaud the game designers for making the decision to include that rather than the normal GP, SP, CP, whatever you want to use for your abbreviations for money. I thought there was some interesting and very useful little nuggets of role-playing advice dotted throughout the chapter, such as selling or reacting appropriately to damage in combats and other situations.
Again, in this chapter, I found there were some nice little hints for people that are starting out role playing.
Yeah.
Nice little tips about running sessions for beginners, about wrangling your players and what to award XP for, and that's all really good stuff. Nice to see it in there.
Okay, so we'll go on to chapter 4, which is extras, and I thought this was a very worthwhile inclusion. NPC extras do a lot, in my opinion, to speed up the game and provide that cinematic feel. They represent all the multitude of goons, minions, whatever you want to call them, that the PCs sieve through in order to get to the real enemy. However, as you pointed out, there's no real sample monsters or henchmen in this chapter just to pick up and sort of use.
At this point of reading the book, I did get some paper together, gen up a character, and I was all ready to try out this number system that I just started to get my head around, and there's no monsters to test it against. So I had to go back and gen up something else before I could even just try out the system. Would have been nice to have had just a couple of sample monsters.
As you were saying as well, the creators no doubt very skilled at maintaining consistency within a campaign world, and gives quite a lot of useful information for a lot of people who are still, like you say, people who are just starting out. And that's unfortunately a very short chapter. I would have liked to see that expanded, maybe with some examples, like you were saying.
Yeah, although having read further on from when we made these notes, there is a chunk later on of lots of tips and hints in that geography section,
Yeah.
and little sample NPCs and things you could use, although not with any stats.
Okay, so we'll go on to chapter 5 and chapter 6, which we're going to cover together, because this is the advantages and the imperfections. And this is a fairly standard list of merits and flaws, which is clearly written, nothing too unusual or unexpected, very functional. It didn't really set my world on fire, but then merits and flaws sections in books, while useful, aren't normally the most exciting sections to read. I thought it was perfectly well written though, and I'm sure it'd be more useful when you're genning a character. Chapter 7, skills. Fairly standard skills chapters, nothing too unexpected. Nice to see some examples of what the skills can be used for in the write-ups, although some of the explanations are a little confused. Passions are an interesting concept, and I can see the point of having some sort of role-playing guideline on the character sheet. Not sure I'm entirely comfortable with having them assigned fluctuating numerical value though.
Again, with the passions, some of the things that were listed in the book seem just a little bit simplistic. Religion was specifically under the boundaries of hate, whereas religion can obviously fall into hate or love, or indeed piety, one would assume. Love described as a light and positive emotion. Not all the time it ain't.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It has sort of taken very complex concepts and rendered them down to a fairly simplistic sort of like one-dimensional view by putting them in these little sort of pigeonholes in these boxes.
It's one of these system mechanics that's an interesting idea, but if your gamers are good enough and they want to do those kind of stories, they don't need a mechanic. If they're not into that kind of thing, don't force them into it with a mechanic. That just doesn't seem right.
Yeah, I think if you are trying to encourage a sort of more representation of this sort of like these internal forces, these internal factors, you're far better to try and sort of lead by example and by drawing them in with detailed NPCs who try and bring those characteristics out of them, rather than sort of slapping a number on a label and saying, oh, well, you should be behaving in this way because you've got a piety of 5 or a hate of 6 or whatever. To chapter 8, weapon skills. Now, this has 9 full colour pages showing pictures of weapons. And whilst it's nice to see what things look like, I'm a big fan of knowing what things look like, so I've not got a vast encyclopedic knowledge stored in my head of how faux medieval weapons look. I do question whether or not the sheer amount of pages used was entirely necessary.
I quite liked that artwork. It didn't seem to go with some of the rest of the artwork in the book. I get the feeling they've used maybe a couple of different artists. It was nice, but it was a big chunk of pages.
Yeah, it was nicely written, fairly straightforward layout. Although personally, I would rather have had all of the weapons, damages, etc. written on a big table, so I'd have found it easier to reference during a game, rather than having to comb through lots of paragraphs of writing to find what I wanted. We will lead on from this into chapter 9, which is all about combat.
At the very start of that chapter, in lovely big bold print, are the sums involved to do combat. Nice, clearly written, brilliant. I love it when they do that.
Yeah, I think this is probably the first time the actual effects of a boost are mentioned here, which is something you came across while we're reading through it.
I haven't been able to locate it.
Yeah, although they reference a lot of times before any sort of explanation occurs that you get +1 damage in combat per boost. Up until now, every time it was referenced, I'd worked out exactly how you got a boost, how you obtained a boost, but I had no idea what effect it'd be. And if it not for you spotting that tiny reference to it, I'd still be clueless to this very day. Now, you were saying that you weren't really keen on the implication that miniatures.
He had a bit of a go about miniature users. I like using miniatures. I don't think miniatures prevent your imagination from working or stop the GM from giving better descriptions about how players act or what monsters are doing or what the room looks like. It sort of implies here that you can't do one without the other, or why not do both? Because I like to see exactly where I am in that combat. He's 10 feet away, I can't hit him with my 6-foot stick.
I have to agree. I mean, I'm not a big fan of using miniatures in games. However, I do think it's very much down to personal choice. And I have played in games that use miniatures, and as you say, I don't think it hampers your imagination in any way, any more than drawing a rough sort of map on a piece of paper does, or as I do with some of my Fate games, putting some index cards down to represent the areas. It's just a handy way to keep everything in order. I don't think it necessarily means that you can't provide a better description. You can't describe how your combat blows rain down on your enemies, etc. I don't think that's the case at all.
This was also the page with the girl with her nips out.
Oh yes, the picture of the barely lit woman wearing a randomly see-through shirt, which didn't seem to have any particular reason for being there.
Before anybody starts calling me a prude, this girl with her boobs out, I would have loved to have seen her standing in front of a background and known where that background was. I would have loved to have seen her holding a magic item with some sigils round it or something, but she just stood there at the side of the page with her sword out, looking all nonchalant on a plain background. What's she there for? Yeah. Who is she? What race is she? Where's she from?
He didn't really give a sort of window into the fantasy
Not
world.
Really.
Okay, chapter 10 is Poison and Diseases. I believe you were more a fan of this chapter.
Yeah, it gave me a little bit of a more detail of what that world was like to live in. Some nice sort of world-specific poisons and diseases, a little bit of where they're from. Nice adventure hooks. I like adventure hooks. I can steal them.
Great stuff. And chapter 11 is all about divinities, or the deities and gods of the setting. Now, this section, in my opinion, is far too short. For a game that builds itself on the merits of mythology and an immersive mythic history, there's far too little information in this section. It's only 4 pages and only covers 12 of the proffered 77 divinities within the game setting. A specific divinities book is planned and I believe is actually out now, but a nice summary chart here listing brief details of all of them would have been extremely handy. In addition, numerous entities such as trolls, dragons, etc. are mentioned at the start of this chapter, but no further details are given in the rest of this chapter. The information that is here, however, is extremely interesting, but it's little more than a taster, and personally I don't feel it would give me enough information for me to play a religious character in a way that's going to be consistent with the rest of the setting when further material is released.
The next chapter talks about a god called Nif. Where's Nif? I want to know who Nif is.
Yeah, there wasn't actually any information in this chapter about him or her, was there?
But at the very end of this chapter, there's like a paragraph and a half that for me was the first sort of real view of what that world was like and what it's like to live there beyond the poisons and diseases. It talks about how there's a lot of normal world animals that don't exist and there are fantasy creatures instead. Then it doesn't tell me anything else. I want more of that.
Okay. Now, chapter 12, History. Now, this has some extremely interesting origin myths for the world, and you can see the influence of classical mythology on the author, given the battle between pre-god Titan-like deities that wrestled the world into being and the resultant creation of the species. Unfortunately, there's a lot of headings on the sort of timeline of the game that don't contain any information at all.
There seems to be a lot of stuff missing from that timeline as well. Like one that particularly stood out to me was that the gods are created sometime after the human races, possibly by the Titans, possibly by some of the humanoids. There's not much detail, and that they begin to assert their influence, but it never really tells you how they go from that to being the gods. again, more detail.
Yeah, we were saying also as well, this is another place where a glossary of common terms would have been very handy, given the variety of different references and strange terminology that it brings in, and concepts that aren't discussed before then in the book.
Or after in some cases.
Yeah, so this is another place where a glossary would have been extremely handy, especially for people who are picking up the book for the first time. A lot of these terms can be very confusing. We then move on to chapter 13, which is geography.
First look, I thought the demographics were a worthwhile inclusion, and then we started to look a bit closer, and this is probably one of the better chapters in the book. So.
Undoubtedly, for my money, although there is a part where there's a huge double-page spread picture which shows the poisonous blue ocean desert, which has an interesting history behind it, which I won't go into because I don't want to spoil it for anyone. And the picture is fine, there's nothing wrong with the picture, it's a nice picture, but I do have to question whether it really needed an entire two-page spread to show what is effectively a large expanse of blue with some bones sticking up out of it. But there are some interesting plot hooks and ideas in this chapter, and as Hannah said, I do feel this is one of the more interesting and more plot-laden chapters in the book.
I particularly liked the sites of interest that were included in this. There's some really nice descriptions of the city and the areas around them. And what I did find a bit confusing was having really sort of hooked onto that chapter at the end of the divinities about the fantasy animals and that kind of thing. There's then very little reference to any of that in the economy sections, although they do talk about real world food and real world animals. Again, I would have liked a bit more detail of the fantasy world and why it's different to other fantasy worlds.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I think there was some very nice art in this chapter which did a very good job of illustrating these areas of interest, these fantastic locations that were described in just the right level of detail. As we were saying, though, it'd have been nice if this chapter was actually a bit earlier on, because after reading this chapter, it really does do a good job of enthusing you about this strange world and acts as a sort of teaser, drawing you in and making you want to look into it more.
Also absolutely full of adventure hooks in this chapter, but it's not quite detailed enough. You'd have to fill in the blanks yourself, and I love that. It's just a big pile of adventure hooks.
I think almost in some ways, because the way the game opens is with the GMing advice at the very start of the book. I think I'd have almost liked to have had that sort of order sort of continue, because normally in books you tend to get rules first, setting material later, certainly in the D20 book, whereas this book seems to be reversing that trend. I'd almost like to have seen that carry on with the GMing advice at the front, followed by all of these sites of interest and this history and this world detail, and then the rules almost sort of at the back of the book. However, that's just me personally. I know a lot of people do like to jump into the rules straight away, people who make their judgments about what RPGs they play or what RPGs they like based on the rule system, which, to be honest, isn't of paramount importance to me, but some people do like that. Okay, chapter 14 is labelled Other Worlds, and again this offers a tantalising glimpse of other worlds within the cosmology, but it doesn't really give you a great deal of detail. Presumably it will be included in future releases. I don't really mind this since, to be honest, I can't see beginning characters tripping off through the multiverse or whatever passes for the multiverse in this setting at the beginning of their careers.
There's also a really interesting bit at the end of this about the world of the dead and what happens to player characters after they've died, although it sort of surprised me that a world with so many different deities, so many different species, the same thing happens to everyone.
Okay. And that's the last chapter, but we then go on to the first appendix, which is a nice inclusion, I think, which is a calendar. Although you were saying that each god being attached to a certain day, as per the deities chapter, and with the calendar not filling the whole pages, it might have been nice if the deities' names and some other information was included on the calendar.
Yeah, there's a lot you can get to a calendar that can tell you a lot about how that sort of world works. Holy days, festivals, planting times, all that kind of stuff could be put onto a calendar.
And as we were
Also,
saying,
there's a big concentration on the day and night battle, which is mentioned here and there.
Well, it's covered in the next appendix, isn't it? The illumination chart. We were saying that could have just been folded into the calendar, and they wouldn't have needed a separate appendix for it, because a lot of the information is duplicated in Appendix A and Appendix B.
Yeah.
The calendar and the illumination chart. And it could have all potentially been wrapped up in one.
Information, but you could have put a lot more over those 3 pages and told me a lot more that I needed to know.
Mm-hmm. We then go on to the character sheet, which is nice, clearly laid out, functional. That works. There's a smaller version of the Kvegathale map at the back, which is beautifully illustrated, if again a little vague, although I'm sure there'll be more detailed maps released as the game line goes on. So, in conclusion, for the Within the Ring of Fire saga book, I think it's got an intriguing background and an interesting blend of mythologies and legends. It has some excellent games master advice that would benefit anyone seeking to run a fantasy game, although possibly more for those who are just getting started, and probably a lot of people running other systems. There's a lot of intriguing plot hooks and adventure materials included in the book.
Yeah, it's interesting campaign material. It doesn't seem to always gel together brilliantly. Some of it contradicts others, but then that makes sense if it's one racer's version against another.
I think that'll probably be smoothed out a little bit with like later materials as well, because obviously this is the first book that they've released. Personally, I'm not a massive fan of the rules. They do seem to have taken influence from D&D with a little dash of World of Darkness thrown in here and there, but as a fan of games with looser, more narrative-based systems, it's not really for me. If you like D&D style rules, though, it's probably right up the street. You probably really get on with them.
I like the D20 system. I've always been a big advocate of it. There's a reason it's out there. It's to make things nice and simple so that we can jump straight into your interesting setting.
Okay. I think there's some excellent artwork in the book, and some that's perhaps not quite as good. And there does seem to be a little bit of a lack of consistency. You were saying that you don't really see enough of the world through the eyes of the artist.
What's in there is beautiful artwork, but much as I was saying about the picture of the girl with her nips out, it's great artwork, but it doesn't tell me as much as I want to see through that setting. I'd like a few more epic backgrounds, and I would have also liked titles on that artwork telling me where that's a picture of. Yeah,
there was also, when we were looking at it, we were saying that some of the art that shows members of a particular race often appear to have characteristics that don't entirely match the way the race has been described, as though perhaps almost they've been a bit different in an earlier draft and the art had been done based on those. I mean, overall, I think it's a very promising first book for RAW Immersive Games, and it gives me hope for the rest of the game line. I think if you're looking for a set of rules that will seem familiar to players of D&D, but does not use classes and has a more narrative flavour to it, then you may find these rules are just what you're looking for. The background mythology is intriguing and a very worthy attempt to create a campaign world that differs from the normal near real world fantasy ecologies that tend to be encountered in generic fantasy settings like Greyhawk or the Forgotten Realms, etc. Overall, I think I'm unlikely to run the game as is, personally, since, as I say, I'm not a big fan of the D&D style rules myself. However, there are a lot of very interesting elements in the book, certainly in the background and the mythology, which I absolutely love, that, for me, make it a very worthwhile read. And these elements will no doubt be migrating to some of my games in the near future.
I'd very much like to see some of the pre-planned adventures that they put together for this. I think that when it starts to be spread out, the ideas that he's got in there as plot hooks are going to be really interesting and entertaining. But I want to see more of this world in some way. I want more detail of what it's like to live there.
Yeah, in a way, the saga book, which is the core book here, although it contains all of the main rules, it feels like a teaser for the rest of the product line, doesn't it? Really, which to a certain extent, is probably the intended purpose. Obviously, the company, they want to draw you in and get you to invest in the rest of the game line. I do think it would have been nice to see a little bit more of a taster of it, rather than the sort of like the vague sort of hint and suggestions you get in this book. However, I think, as I said, if you're looking for something of a D&D vein, but with a more intriguing mythology and classless, I think you could do far worse than pick up a copy of Within the Ring of Fire. So this has been the Red Dice Diaries, with myself, someone who's been fully immersed in the YouTube hype surrounding this product, and my lovely wife Hannah, who has had no exposure to the YouTube hype whatsoever. Thank you very much for watching. We hope that you'll click on like and subscribe to this video. We put out new videos every Wednesday, and until next time, thank you very much for listening and for watching. Take care.